This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bourderonnet. And this week, it's the two of us, and we are going to talk about how we use 3D images in our office. And and why 3D modeling in the computer is important, and why having 3D views of a project is important for clients and for architects.
Yes.
As we've said many times before, you don't want to start a project where the client on one hand thinks they're going to get certain things and the architect has a different expectation or different assumption. And the word renderings is one of those terms that when anyone says, am I going to see 3D renderings? I say, okay, what precisely do you mean by renderings? And actually, more importantly, let's look at a reference image, right? Does this qualify as a rendering too? And in some cases, it's a screenshot of like a SketchUp model, which anyone who knows SketchUp, you know what it looks like out of the box, right? Yeah. Is that a rendering? Oh yeah, that's a rendering. Okay. Then yes, you're going to see a lot of that. By the way, we don't call those renderings in our profession because you haven't rendered anything, right?
It's raw.
It's just there. In most offices, 3D views, right, which are more basic, should be, we advocate, should be part of the process. So we'll talk about that. 3D renderings, I also think, should be part of the process. But photorealistic renderings, or artist renderings as sometimes they're called, most of the time, those are done by a third party, by a rendering service, right? And that is usually an additional cost that's not within the basic scope of services or deliverables.
Yeah, and I mean, the differences between all of them really is like time and money, right? Everything is possible. It's just how much time do you have to put into making that one image?
And as a quick anecdote, I've been on projects where the clients wanted very near photorealistic renderings. And in the case, this was like a large tower project. So when you do projects like that, it's not just rendering with nice materials and greenery, but there's people. And there's like dogs and cats and all, whatever else is inside the rendering.
You have to create the world around it.
The entire, like, it needs to look like a photograph, like I'm there, with art installations and all these things. But they wanted that in the very beginning of concept design. And they demanded that all the way through, not only that level of quality of the view, but they detailed. Yeah. They were like, where are the light switches? Where are the emergency, fire alarm switches? And our position as the architecture office, and any architect would say this too, is this is the first concept design meeting. We do not need to be concerned with the precise location of the fire alarm switch. It'll be there somewhere where it needs to be, but we're just trying to get the broad strokes out, of the painting. We're not going down to the detailed veins of the leaf yet. Yeah. So that's kind of the landscape of these terms.
So in our office, for example, we use 3D modeling actually pretty heavily, in conjunction with, of course, drawings, plan sketches, diagrams. It's just another way to look at the project from a different perspective, a different angle. Mm-hmm. But we're very pro in using it pretty much throughout the whole project. Yeah,
I think this is an important thing too, because I think maybe for clients, they're first concerned with whether or not an office will do 3D renderings or views is more so that they can understand what's going to be built.
Yeah.
Which, of course, absolutely. However, from an insider's perspective, I would say for a good office, it's not just about what we produce to represent ideas to you, the client, right, as a communication tool. It's also about what do we produce in the office as a part of our working process, as a tool to understand the project, to analyze the project, to ideate, to test ideas, right? It's not like we do all of our work and then the day before the presentation, okay, let's produce some renderings and then show the client. Absolutely not. We're doing that, as you said, very early on, because it's another way to view the project. And there are many benefits to having these 3D views or 3D renderings and models that you can't gain without them.
No, yeah, you're right. And I think the first one you just touched on that is for the client's comprehension of the design. Mm. We're used to look at floor plans and elevations and and sections and looking at those types of drawings pretty regularly so we can understand them. But think about anyone who's never looked at that before.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the first time I looked at an RCP, back in college.
What is an RCP?
A reflected ceiling plan. Yeah. That shows the wiring, the lights and symbols. And I remember the first time looking at that during an internship, I was like, what am I looking at?
Yeah.
You know, because I'm like, what is all of this means? Yeah. It just looks like it's overwhelming. And so, you know, you're overwhelmed. So you're not in a state where you're really like, you know, wanting to get into it. You're just like, you want to step back away from it, right? And then you actually have to get familiar with the symbols, the way things are represented, and then understanding how things get connected to each other and the scale. And, you know, so there is a lot for someone who's never looked at those drawings. It's hard.
It's very difficult.
It's much easier to look at an image of a room, like what a room would be, what the front of my house might look like in real life, right? With some shadows, some trees, some grass, a dog walking by, you know, it's just the projection level of the drawing is much more complicated than an image.
Yeah. Plans and elevations are these orthographic projections, is what we call them. They're weird, abstract things, as a weird way to understand a project. I think also
to the exploded axonometry.
Yeah, I think the other benefit though is maybe more internally from a professional standpoint is it allows us to catch problems that you don't see in plan and elevation. I've done projects that were 99% designed strictly in plans, elevations, and sections, so almost no 3D. And it's certainly possible, yes. And in that case, we didn't even have a physical model. We didn't have a physical model, but it requires a lot of brain power, which is an exercise. It was just a muscle that I think architects need to have anyway. But you're going to miss something. You're going to miss something by the time you weave into not just the pretty picture, but you're thinking about structure, mechanical, and all those things coming through the project. You're going to miss something. And so it's a great benefit to have these things in 3D because it's error detection, really.
It's error detection. It's basically a planning tool before you get into the real world. And it's cheaper to work it out in the computer than building it, tearing it down, fixing it, discovering it way too late. You know, after other things have been built on top of it, like it gets messy.
It's also easier in 3D to see the relationships between things sometimes. Sometimes you really need a 3D view to understand the proportions of shapes or the proportions of spaces, and certainly what it means to experience a space in more of a first-person perspective, which is, again, very difficult to achieve when you're looking at a straight, a flat section or flat elevation.
And I feel like sometimes it's also easier to show the client, you know, if you have, let's say, options for something, to show them the options in 3D because they get a better feel for it than if it's just 2D drawings.
There's more of an emotional response, I would say, which I think is the benefit, and not to jump to the next part, but also the negatives of 3D is that, so the benefits of it, like you said, there's an emotional, you get it, right? You feel it. There's a visual response to it. But it also means that you're not witnessing maybe more the analytical side of the design, if that makes sense. Like 3D images are great for mood, material, light, sometimes composition. Like those ones are the big heavy hitters, right? They're not so great for showing how program affects the usage of a house. They're also not great a lot of times at showing circulation, where in a plan you can do a diagram to show like this is how you flow through the space. It doesn't show flow. Yeah, exactly.
Well, unless you do a 3D walkthrough, which is another tool that you could use.
But even then, it's an interesting thing. So what I'm highlighting too is that it's very easy for a 3D rendering to look very convincing because of the materials, the light, and everything else, right?
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, wow, this looks really good. Let's do it. However, a lot of times for the untrained eye, what that person, the client, is really convinced by is not really the design. They're more convinced by the rendering machine, right? The beauty of the lighting and the materials, the soft lighting coming in at the perfect time of day and the cast shadow of the foliage. You're falling in love with that stuff, but not actually like 90% of the design itself.
No, you're right. And, you know, we are in a society nowadays where everybody is addicted to pretty images. So it is very easy and tempting to just fall in love with an image for other reasons than what the image is supposed to be about.
Yeah, and the same thing actually applies to architectural photography if we think about it that way too. You can take a pretty poor house, photograph it a certain way, and have it look also very convincing, like on real estate websites. And then you go there and realize, oh, this is like not at all what was being represented. And that's the danger of 3D images.
That's the danger if you, let's say, only work in 3D.
Mm-hmm.
I think, what we do in the office and I think overall as probably good practice is to keep switching the tools that you're using to get the best outcome. Mm-hmm. Right? If you only use a spoon to create a sculpture, it might be great, right? But it's only going to give you so many options. So you're going to be limited. Going back between the floor plan, elevation, sketches, diagrams, back to 3D, I think it just gives you a better understanding of the project and its multiple facets.
No, it does. And I recall when computer 3D modeling became much more mainstream, that there was this projection or this idea that some professionals and academics had that all designing will now be done in perspective, right? In the 3D model view. And we're not going to use plans and elevations and sections. It's going to happen only in 3D. And there's some rare instances where like the vast majority of the process happens in 3D. And even rare instances where you don't really have plans or elevations or sections as a tool to design through. But that's really not the case. That was almost the dumbest thing I've ever heard when that person said it, because each of these views provides a very particular set of ways to critique and understand that same project. And you need to understand the project from all those different views because there are different lists of criteria. And projects that don't, they suffer tremendously on both sides. Projects that have no 3D, something's going to be wrong. And projects that are done entirely in 3D, they just lack the cohesiveness and all the other kind of things that I mentioned before that comes with plans or elevations for that matter.
I think the other use of 3D is one, to kind of communicate what we're trying to create to the other stakeholder on the project. So like the contractors, let's say, the other consultants on board, like, yeah, they're accustomed to look at drawings so they can understand it, but having that visual reference available also makes the time that they need to understand the project a little bit shorter. They could get it much faster by just looking at that. So it's not just for the person who's creating it. It's not just for the person who's buying the design. It's also for anybody who's gonna try to put it together, basically.
Yeah. So for example, in the construction document set, which of course are the drawings that the contractor uses to build from, let's say roughly that's what they're for. At the last pages of the CD set, we always include 3D images of the project. Now, that's not what the contractor builds from, but it's to provide an overview, because also you have to imagine on the project, it's not just the head contractor, the general contractor. There's a bunch of subs and a bunch of other people on there, and they're coming in and out of the project or between different projects. And it's very helpful for them to, at a snapshot, get a very clear understanding, like a 3D view of like what this thing is, right? Because again, technical drawings are abstract. And so I think the larger point is that even for the professionals, the subcontractors, the contractors, us and the engineer, everybody, right? It's still helpful to have 3D because there's no faster way to just get it. Like, what is this thing? Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Because otherwise, what are we doing? We're stitching together in our minds conceptually this black and white plan drawing, this section and this elevation and then this roof plan, and like, okay, let's see what this thing is in my imagination, right?
Yeah. So maybe we can talk about how we use 3D on a project through like the different phases. So for example, when we start concept design, we usually start putting the project in the computer to look at it in 3D from more of a massing, what we call massing, which means more like building blocks.
Yeah.
Type
large
of
geometries.
Yeah, like geometry, composition on the site, orientation, pitch roof, flat roof, 2-story, 1-story, like push back, recessed entrance, kind of like the big block that the house or the project would fit in.
Yeah.
And then when we move into more schematic designs, that's where we start to kind of like carve that block out and like create openings, refine the roof, maybe start putting materials, maybe look at views from the exterior, from the interior, right? We start to think about, okay, like what are the key elements that makes this project?
Yeah, and a lot of I would describe it like, so the concept design massing is fairly abstract, right? And I think when we get to schematic design, that's when it becomes much more tangible and real. I would say that generally, thinking back on it, we generally start to implement materials pretty early on.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if the project is going to be all white, then it's all white. But beyond that, materials have a really big impact in defining what a thing is, the nature of the thing, whether it be a window, a wall, a door, a roof, something in between all of those. And so I find it very difficult in a way to work in 3D at the SD level without an understanding of palette. I'm not saying that the palette we choose is the final one, but a poured in place concrete wall is just it's different. It feels different, has different meaning than if it were to be made out of wood or polished aluminum. Like those are radically different things.
Yeah, it gives you kind of a feel for it, and it's easy enough that you can like swap materials and kind of see like how it feels, like how just changing that one wall could impact the overall feeling of the project.
And sometimes the solution is more about the materials than it is about changing the shape of the thing, right? And so, but in schematic design, it's as I said, it's not about choosing the specific final material, but it's oftentimes more about, like, we will talk about the materials in terms of hardness and softness and the effect they have rather than the material itself. So at an early phase, it's not like we're saying this has to be marble that has like crazy veining on it, right? It's more about, well, we want something here that's going to be hard and glossy and have some pizzazz, right? That's the description. Now, what exactly that is it a marble? Is it a terrazzo? Is it a metal? I don't know. But it's going to perform in this manner. We want something here that feels more earthy and more grounded because of how it's beating the ground or the roof or whatever. Is it poured in place concrete? Is it some other stone or whatever else? I don't know yet, but it's something of that nature.
Yeah, you're starting to dab into, the final decisions that you're going to have to make for the design, but you're not committed yet. You're still kind of like testing ground.
Yeah, and I think it's also important. It helps the clients, but it helps the process, because the worst thing you can have happen is that, let's say if you're an architect or you're working with an architect and they're producing this all white model, because they're only in concept design or schematic design and they want to talk about materials yet. They produce all this white model, and then you get to the next phase and the client's like, okay, I was thinking it's all brick. And architects can be like, well, I thought it was all going to be, I don't know, travertine or whatever other material. And now you're very far from being on the same page. So, I mean,
And that posed kind of the question of, working in 3D and making things look decent for the client to understand the ideas that you're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
While not being committed to everything. And it's kind of a fine line, because as soon as you show an image to a client, they're going to think that's it.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to, let's say, show them an image and be like, okay, this is the image of your house, but ignore the materials, ignore this, because we haven't really like quite defined that. It's just kind of like focus on the overall aspect of it. And some clients have the ability to do that. Some others don't. Some others get so excited that they love the way it is. And then like it's kind of hard to keep moving that conversation around.
Well, this is part of the conversation that a lot of us architects and designers have behind closed doors without clients, is how do we show 3D things without having to go full force and produce a photorealistic image? How do we show something in 3D to convey the aspects of the project that we want to convey, but not convey the other stuff? One of the things with plans and elevations and sections is it's relatively easy for us to communicate and show only the thing we want to talk about. at that particular, because in the back of our minds, we know what we want to talk about and when in the process, and the clients don't. So one of the things that happens in the process is clients in like an early meeting will be like, well, let's talk about, fire switches or whatever. And like, no, that's not really the time. We're going to focus on this is the conversation right now, because I know the process. And it's much easier to do that with certain documents like plans and elevations and diagrams. In 3D images, you kind of open up a can of worms a lot of times if you don't do the image right? So if you show a 3D image of I don't know, a living room, kitchen kind of space, well, there's a million things the client can point to, right? There's the light, there's the window, there's the mullion sizes, the color of the mullions, there's the location of the windows, there's the countertop material, the thickness of the countertop, the drawer. There's a bajillion things, right? Because you're showing all that stuff. And meanwhile, most often, there's almost never an image in the design process where you want to show all of that. You really only have an image that's meant to convey everything in the design in its totality when you're done designing, right? And so that's a tricky line, right? How do you show a 3D image but pare it down or do it in a way where it focuses the conversation to what should be talked about now and what not should be talked about?
And that's why I think it's better to show 3D views throughout the whole process from the beginning until like you're like close to like CDs, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than wait until everything's designed to show things. Because it's easier for people to understand, okay, we started with this like white cube that was on the site. Now we're like slowly carving it out. Now we're slowly, showing interior layout. Now we're slowly showing like more details of everything and define the selection of materials.
Yeah, I think the other solution to it too, which we do all the time for any presentation, is we first state what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And the goals to focus and frame things. Now,
yeah, it's okay to tell them, some of those things are placeholder.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do that on the initial the first slide of our presentations always have like, the phase that we're in and the room that we're looking at, but just white. So there's no graphic. So anyway, my point is that we say that before we show anything, because as soon as you show something, all eyes and attention, whatever you're saying, no one's listening to.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way. You put up a image of something in front of me, I'm just going to look at that and think about that. The speaker could be talking about going to Mars. I wouldn't even know. I'm looking at the image. So I think it's a very important communication tool and tactic, I guess, to outline what's going to take place and preface it before you get into it, especially if you're going to dive into something very complex and something that could be more easily misinterpreted based on design or misinterpreted in terms of conversation topic.
Yeah. And then we use 3D throughout, the design development phase. And we usually use it to kind of define the more detailed aspects of the design. We also use it to look more closely at the lighting and the materials again.
Yeah, like closer to final material selection.
Like do we have a cove light? Do we have downlights? Is, like where's the lighting coming from? Yeah. What exactly is the texture or the scale of the material or the pattern of the tile that goes on the wall? Where are the joints? We actually look at that in 3D because, again, those things you could look at in 2D. But you don't... The problem with 2D, for example, interior elevations, is that you see one wall at a time.
Yeah.
You don't see, like the three walls touching each other. Mm-hmm. You don't see how the ceiling and the floor interact with the three walls, right? Yeah. So...
it's an interesting thing because there is call it geometrical coherency within a project that should exist. Like things and objects and portions of elevations should align compositionally. Like it should produce a composition. And the composition is understood in a few ways. The first is in a straight elevation, right? So if you're talking about the primary elevation, the wall of a kitchen, looking at that elevation view, just in the elevation views is actually very, very useful because it's easier to see the thing you're creating and to see the shortcomings of it, right? And that's the negative of a 3D model a lot of times. When you're orbiting around in 3D, you don't get to critique that elevation at that high level that you get to do in the elevation view. Conversely, in real life, though, that wall's meeting other walls, like you said, it's really hard to understand how that wall works with everything else around it in a straight orthographic projection like an elevation or plan. It's almost not possible, which again goes back to this idea that you need to use both tools.
What, or then imagine even further, like you're in the space and you see into the adjacent space. Like you can get that with the 2D drawings,
Yeah.
like you have two different spaces overlapping each other.
Yeah, so on that note, like one of the things that happens when we're looking at a floor plan, we'll say, okay, what we did here is like this wall terminates at this point. What's going to happen when you live in the house is when you turn the corner, you're going to have this moment where this view lines up and you see this perfectly framed, tree garden space that we've designed, and maybe there's a nice sculpture that sits on the shelf or whatever. There's this moment that's going to happen. And you're explaining it in plan. You're like, wow, that's cool. But it doesn't really get conveyed truly until you have that 3D view. And that's also why I think doing snapshots as you move through the space is one aspect of 3D. So you get that moment when you turn the corner and you see it in 3D. Oh, there it is. You have all this other stuff happening in the space, yes, but I'm focused on this thing that in the plan, I see it, but I don't feel it, right?
Well, and lastly, I think we also use 3D during CA, which is construction administration. Once construction starts, there is like weird conditions that are going to pop up, or things that maybe, we don't get to do drawings for everything because that would just take forever. So we do, most drawings that we will most likely need to build the project, but we can't draw everything. It's impossible.
No office will. It's a waste of time.
So, at some point, that 3D model that is a work in progress type of tool is very helpful to go back to if things need to change slightly. Let's say you have like a ceiling condition. You open up that soffit, you thought there was nothing in it, and guess what? There is a pipe. So we need to keep the soffit, but maybe we can redesign it in a way that's a bit more integrated, right? Yeah. So we're going back into the 3D usually first to try and solve that issue because we have the understanding of the three-dimensional space rather than looking at it in pure elevation or plan. Yeah. And then you could also use that model to detail very specifically, almost like, sharp drawing level, some very small detail within the project. So let's say you have a custom built, shelf or a wall unit or whatever, right? Or a window detail that's a little bit tricky. Well, you could do that 2D section in CAD or BIM. Or maybe you could do more of an axonometric view, so you kind of get a better feeling of what this could look like. Or you can build it in 3D and then explode the parts to kind of show like how things fit within each other. That could be helpful for the contractor. It could be helpful for like a special fabricator that's used on the project that maybe doesn't have the time to go through the whole set of drawings to figure out like where it is, what it is, so you can kind of send like a little sketch that just explains that one part. Yeah.
It's interesting when you get to construction, the fourth dimension to construction is time
and money.
And well, yeah, but how things get installed and in what order, right?
Yeah.
So there's another level of physicality that takes place, and oftentimes for tricky details, it's just easier to visualize in 3D space to be like, okay, there's first this thing, and then this thing comes in, and then another thing comes in, and this is how they're going to interlock. Oh, that doesn't work because you can't fit that second piece now. So how do you resolve that?
And that's a very good point. Like the sequence of operation on a construction site. I mean, architects have a general understanding, but we can't think of everything we draw in design as like, okay, well, we're going to put this first and that first. Therefore, this can be there. Like, there's too many pieces.
No, and a lot of that problem solving for complex or custom homes, it happens when it needs to happen. Yeah. Because there's like a million decisions to be made in terms of how things are constructed. Now, if you're doing a basic spec house, then yeah, everyone knows the recipe, but who's interested in doing that? But for custom things, yeah, it's the sub. It's the person who's actually going to do the work, the installation, is going to be the person to sit down and problem solve. Okay, how do I make this happen?
Well, they're going to have feedbacks, and they're going to get back to the designer and like find ways to make it happen. So 3D to me is really a tool from the beginning of a project up until the end.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because I just cannot imagine like I had posted a quote saying that all architects should be able to produce 3D views or something to that effect. Yeah. And I said that because I just cannot imagine going through and designing. I can't imagine designing a project. I can't imagine conveying a project to a client and conveying a project to other professionals without 3D. And at this point, with the technology we have and its accessibility, there's no reason for that not to take place.
I mean, people who say, well, like the cathedral and this and that, they built it without a 3D model, without drawings. Yeah, anything is possible. But we're in 2023, we don't need to operate that way. And, even Frank Lloyd Wright had to do like
physical models,
a bunch of physical model and colored sketches to communicate his idea to his clients. He wasn't just doing like 2D plans and elevations. So
I do think quickly and more in the architectural history of things, I do think that prior to the advent of 3D computer modeling, there was a lot less that clients knew about of the building.
Oh, yeah.
So it was obviously plans, elevations, and sections, which, as we've said, have their shortcomings in terms of conveying the project to the client. They also had physical models and they had 3D hand-drawn renderings, but they're just far less, far less, because it takes a lot of time to draw a 3D view of something. And even then, if you draw it, they're not photorealistic, and they're not even nearly as realistic as basic renderings or even screen snapshot views of a lot of 3D programs. They're not as real. They're abstract watercolor things with thick outlines and stuff, right? Which, if you have an architect or you're working with an architect who operates that way and you totally dig it, then fine. But I find that the clients that we work with, they appreciate having a much greater sense of like what the actual thing is going to be. There's still always a gap, this magical gap from the rendering to the real thing. The real thing's always much more impressive.
And they're always, they're still always very surprised of when it's done, like how it looks in a good way, right? Mm-hmm. There's still some elements of surprise because the 3D doesn't show some of those nuances, but I feel like they also feel more confident in the choices that they make. Yeah. They also trust us more because we're not hiding anything from them, as to what's going to happen. And it also allows them to see options and make up their mind, and maybe for us to dive deeper into what they are into, mm-hmm. rather than trying to talk about what they like or want without really having a visual understanding of it.
Yeah.
Like we're just shooting in the dark if we do that.
Yeah, or we're trying to use tools that are just limited.
Yeah.
I also want to say though that like we hear from a lot of architects, well, it's a slippery slope because then the clients are always asking for 3D views or 3D renderings, or at worst, photorealistic renderings way too often. And it's just the amount of time that we have to then allocate just to producing 3D stuff is just so much higher than I want it to be, and than it needs to be, more importantly. Like it's not necessary for us to produce a good building to do all this 3D stuff. And to that, on that subject, I say, I want to be very clear that we, in what we do, we still very much control what we show. We don't just produce stuff because someone asks for it, right? So if a client asks for something and we feel truly it's not appropriate for the phase that we're at, we won't do it. That might sound crazy, but we'll say, we'll explain to them, obviously. We won't just say no. We'll explain to them, like, we'll call it no, because right now we want to look at these things. It's more productive, efficient, and will probably yield a better outcome if we go through what we know works. And we also, you will see that. Like, it'll happen. Don't worry. We're not going to build without you knowing what's happening. It'll happen, but right now is not the time for it. And people get it.
Yeah, and same with like the in-house rendering versus the photorealistic renderings. Like, you have to explain to the client when it makes sense to do this or that. Mm-hmm. Sure, you could charge the clients for photorealistic renderings or do renderings all the time throughout the phases. Is it necessary? Probably not. Like the white box probably doesn't deserve like a photorealistic rendering because there's nothing in it. Yeah. So it's kind of, but you just have to explain to them when and why and how it should be used.
Yeah, it's sort of like, because design, as people have probably heard on here, it's an iterative process, and it's a process of experimentation. And it's kind of like a sculpture. You start off with this big block of clay, and you don't jump from the big block of clay to like the final preview of it. You go from the big block to the massing, right? Okay, maybe it has a big round base and a square top, sort of, and then you mush that into the next thing, and things become more and more refined until you get down to, you know, the size of the pupils and the eye or whatever. And what happens is, and that is the process for sculpture, because there's no way around it. It's a physical thing. You have to do that. But the design process for architecture is pretty much the same thing. And what happens is, in architecture, if you jump from the big block, which is nothing, or the blank site in the case of architecture, and you jump forward to final details with like the exact specification of door handles, it's not going to be good.
No, and I think it goes back to, again, like not over showing things unless it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have to do renderings or photorealistic renderings from the get-go. And you probably should not just show 3D images. You should show also like 2D drawings, like plans and elevation, because it really depends what you're trying to communicate, you know, and the client should understand that, again, those are tools to communicate ideas. They're not just like whatever you feel like showing today, you know.
They're actually more representative of the thinking behind the project, rather than it being maybe the thing itself sometimes.
So I hope this clarified a little bit of, like, you know, the use of 3D, the different types of images, how we personally use it in the office, how other people maybe might use it.
And the limitations of 3D.
And the limitations of it. I think, you know, we should all be aware of that.
Just because something looks good in 3D does not mean it's going to look good in real life or feel good. And that's, I think, a key takeaway I want people to know. Because I do see there are offices that rely so heavily on it, and it's very convincing, again, from a quick glance, but that doesn't mean it's going to feel good. And conversely, I'm not convinced by I'm just critiquing offices. I'm not convinced by offices who do plans and they do some reference images and then kind of a loose sketch and then they're good to go. There's like, to me, you're not testing the design in that final pass, right? In that final lens that it should take place.
Yeah, testing the design is an interesting idea.
That's really what it's all about.
Yeah.
Is using tools to test the design.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, I feel like when you create an image, there is sometimes like a finality to that image.
You're thinking of a 3D view?
Especially if, well, no, I'm thinking more of like just an in-house rendering, right? Because there is a feeling of like, well, you know, it looks pretty good. And just leave it there.
Yeah.
Rather than like actually going back to the plan, looking if it, does it actually make sense? Or like, you know, like it's a tool that should be questioned.
Yeah.
And you know, and used to work on things rather than press the button and think, well, it looks fine. Especially
when something is appealing for purely aesthetic reasons, and even more so if those reasons have not to do with the physical design.
Yeah.
Not to do with proportion, materials, location of window, not to do with that, but just to do with it looks pretty.
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
Totally.
And I think that's
a danger.
That's a danger.
Well, I hope this was helpful, you know, for people who are in the field or are in the field, kind of like making the distinctions between those different types of 3D images that are available out there. I love bringing a bit more clarity to this world.
Yeah.
If you like what we do, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Pretty much any podcast platform out there, we should be on it.
We're also on social medias, primarily Instagram. That's where we're at. Got a nice little following there. And people can reach out to us through the website. We have a website, which is secondstudiopod.com. We have a email, which is hello@secondstudiopod.com. And then a hotline, which people can text or call to leave a voicemail if you have questions or suggestions. And that number is 213-222-6950.
Yeah.
Right?
And of course, if you love the show, leave us a review.
Yeah.
It's always helpful.
Yep. I think that's it.
All right. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.